the latest episode of Called to the Bar, International Law Over Drinks. I'm your host, Dr. Tamsin Phillipa Paige, Associate Professor at Deakin Law School. Today we are discussing UN special procedures, what they are, who are the people that make them happen, and who are the people that make them happen. For this conversation, I'm joined by Professor Ben Saul, Challis Chair of International Law at Sydney Law School and UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism, which is a mouthful, I've got to say, as a title. And Dr. Pichamon Yeophantong, Associate Professor at the Centre for Future Defence and National Security at Deakin University, and a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. Before we begin, I remind everyone that in these informal conversations, we are, as always, speaking off the cuff and without the benefit of footnotes, and nothing we say should be taken to have been thoroughly peer-reviewed. I will also note that our guests are speaking in their personal capacity and nothing they say can be attributed to their employers or any other organisation they work with. And now, before we get down to business, our traditional first question. Pichamon, Ben, what's your drink?
I'll go first and say that I'm a very boring person, apparently, and I have good old H2O next to me.
And my default drink is always a mojito, and failing that, any kind of beer keeps me happy.
Excellent. I have had my caffeine intake limit for the day in about a whole pot of coffee. So I have gone for an Australian classic and a non-alcoholic ginger beer for this one. Now, neither of you have been on the pod before, and we usually start by asking new guests, how did you get into international law, and what career path brought you to your present job or jobs in this case for both of you? Would you mind telling us how you got to where you are?
Happy for you to go first, Ben.
Thank you. Look, for me, a pretty classic case of being bored at law school with compulsory domestic law subjects. Saw myself going into a career in Australian literature, which was where I was heading with my honours work. And then in the sort of final year at law school, got this amazing opportunity to go to work with UNHCR for some time in Nepal with Bhutanese refugees, and just really for the first time saw the power of international law in action. That really inspired me to explore ways of pursuing a career. Hard to do in Australia, or from Australia, of course. But eventually, after a few false starts, wound up doing a doctorate in international law at Oxford in the UK, and came back to Australia. Academia was probably the best way to choose your own adventure in working in international law from Australia. And it's given me the freedom to do all kinds of things, and here I am.
And in my case, I think my trajectory has not been so very straightforward. I am a political scientist by training, so my background is in political science and international relations, less international law per se. But I think similar to Ben, my interest in the area of business and human rights really started when I did field work in a range of countries in Asia, ranging from China through to Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, and seeing firsthand the impacts that investment projects can have on communities as well as on the environment. And it was from there that I started kind of getting much more into the questions around how can we regulate these investments better. And that was what I would say really propelled my interest forward and got me involved in the work of the working group and in trying to comprehend how we can make the implementation of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights more effective.
Fantastic. That's a really great synopsis. And Ben, I share your pain from undergrad of boredom with domestic law, and that's how I also ended up in international law as well. So I think it's a common theme for Australian international lawyers in that regard. On to our main event. So, for most people who don't work in human rights spaces, the UN Special Procedures Framework is probably understood about as well as I understand trade law, which is to say, not very well. Can you explain to our listeners first what the UN Special Procedures mechanisms are, how they came into being, and how they function?
Sure, and look, I didn't know a lot about special procedures before I became part of it, actually, and getting to know it has been super interesting because after the modern human rights movement began after the Second World War with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there were a couple of decades where there really wasn't much by way of active or intrusive human rights monitoring of state performance. And so that begins to change by the kind of late 1960s as the balance of power changes in the UN system with newly independent, decolonized states. You get a couple of procedures established early on dealing with apartheid in Southern Africa, dealing with military dictatorships in Latin America. And that's the beginnings of the system. And these days, there are 46 what we call thematic mandates, which deal with particular rights or particular human rights problems and 13 country-specific mandates. So they're all independent experts. They're not UN officials as such. They're not political appointees. They're appointed on merit. And different mandates have different functions, which we can talk a little bit about a bit more in a moment.
So, as Ben was saying, we do have slightly different functions. At the same time, we share the same status as Ben was saying, independent experts, where all of us are non-salaried by the UN. So this is part of the reason why we all have other jobs, like being an academic and so forth. And as I like to tell other people, it feels like having two jobs or sometimes 10 jobs, given how demanding it is to actually fulfill the functions of an independent expert. On top of that, I would add that it's been really interesting for me as well to get an kind of insider look at how special procedures work, because I personally was very fascinated by the reports that special rapporteurs, working group members, independent experts have done in the past. I remember that one of my original my original fascination in becoming a mandate holder was due to a report that I read from the special rapporteur on the situation in Cambodia. And it was a few years back, but it was such in a sense, a very inspiring read because, to see all of those human rights violations and abuses detailed in a way that was so compelling. And then to also see that this is still a report that it bears the UN logo, even though it's independent, was something powerful. So I think we inhabit this very interesting space where we are at once independent, but we also, if I can put it this way, benefit from that UN affiliation to the extent that we're able to really help raise, concerns about human rights violations and abuses at that global level. And I can see, and I have seen, I should say, firsthand how impactful that can be, especially for communities. So just wanted to add those 2 cents.
Yeah, and before we move on to the next formal question, just kind of a follow-up on that, where within, I assume, the Secretariat does the special procedures sit, and does it have any kind of interrelation with the broader, say, UPR mechanisms and things like that that go on around human rights or the ICCPR committee and those other human rights bodies? How do you relate special procedures to those mechanisms?
The way I see it is that, I mean, again, for special procedures, we are fact-finding monitoring mechanisms of the Human Rights Council. Our secretariat, so the teams that support our work, are actually from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, so OHCHR. In terms of how we kind of interact, it's been really interesting, I would say, because OHCHR does respect our independence very much. So even though they're supporting our work, they are also, trying to give us as much space as possible to do what we need to do and to say what we want to say. So in a way, it's been a very productive relationship in the experience of the working group. But Ben may well want to add more to that.
Yeah, look, I'd just add we absolutely benefit from and draw on the expertise of OHCHR, the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I mean, they obviously have a much larger global footprint than special procedures in that they have country offices, they have thematic desks, and so we get a lot of information about human rights violations from OHHR. They can, check a lot of facts and issues for us. At the same time, there are of course tensions. I mean, we're independent experts, so we are free to maintain, to some extent, different positions from the office on certain questions. They face institutional and bureaucratic constraints and funding constraints, which are different to the ones that we face. If they want to keep an office open in an authoritarian country, they may need to maintain, some semblance of positive relations with that government that may affect the extent to which they can speak out or on certain issues. The other issue is a really difficult one, which is that because they are our secretariat, their staff report to OHEHR, not to us. Their funding for some mandates comes from OHEHR, not from the member states dedicating resources to our mandates specifically. And so in a climate of incredible liquidity crisis where the UN is on the verge of being broke, that can create certain tensions about the prioritization of resources, who decides where resources go and for what purposes. The UN is broke, and we're the most broke part of the UN. So it does create certain kinds of pressures that if you were designing system from scratch, you absolutely wouldn't design it in this way.
If I
Thanks.
may add,
Oh, please add to that.
if I may add, it just occurred to me that there was a second part to your question, Tamsin, around how we work with like UPR, treaty buddies. And I would say that I can only speak for the working group, so I won't speak for other mandates, but we do try our best to engage with treaty buddies. And we are aware as well that the recommendations, the reports that we produce do occasionally get mentioned or cited in UPRs, and vice versa. So we also keep a close eye on developments in the UPR space, when states are part of that and what they say, et cetera. Most recently, the working group has been communicating a lot with the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, so CEDAW, and looking at how we can collaborate further with that treaty buddy as well. But I must say there's a whole lot more that we can be doing, I think, to really improve and enhance the collaboration that can exist between special procedures and treaty buddies. And I know this is becoming much more difficult, as Ben was saying, because of the current liquidity crisis. But as you can imagine, with any large organization, there is also a tendency sometimes for us to really focus on what we're doing, and at times at the expense of kind of keeping an eye on what others are doing that could very well overlap or complement our work. So it's to say that there are efforts underway, and I know other mandates are the same in terms of trying to build those bridges, but it's an ongoing process.
And the other bodies we cooperate with from time to time, I'd mention commissions of inquiry of the Human Rights Council on particular countries, regional human rights mechanisms like the Inter-American system or the European system. On top of that, there are just, particularly relevant UN entities, whether that's, UNHCR on refugees or UN Women on detention issues relating to terrorism in northeast Syria. So there are lots of those kinds of ad hoc engagements, I'd say, as well.
Fantastic. Thank you for that insight. And that I think leads us really well into the next question, which is where do the special rapporteurs and working group members fit within this broader system? So what does your role entail, and how did you get such a role?
Pichamon, over to you.
Thanks, Ben. And that's really the question, Tamsin. Well, I think we have such a unique place within the broader UN system because of our independence, our autonomy, our ability to say things that other parts of the UN can't easily say. because it may well be politically controversial or sensitive. And that is where I think we find a lot of the power that special procedures hold as a whole. I would say, as Ben was pointing out, we do work collaboratively across the system. So for the working group on business and human rights, we engage very closely and we coordinate very closely with other UN entities such as the International Labour Organization, ILO, with UNICEF, also with obviously OCHR, but also IOM, the International Organization for Migration. So we work with a lot of these other UN entities to ensure that our work and their programming are aligned insofar as possible. And it's not always easy because, again, we come from a very different, almost kind of bringing to bear an intersectional perspective. We come from a very different starting point or departure point from colleagues who are working within the UN system and who may well face a different set of constraints. And so therefore, I think there is an art of cooperation in terms of how we position ourselves in relation to the rest of the work that the UN does. And at the same time, I think our role is also to what's the word, to really try and stimulate discussion and debate, to ensure that the important issues when it comes to human rights violation and abuses in some of the ongoing conflicts that we see, that it doesn't get glossed over with diplomatic speak. This is not to say that other UN entities are doing that in any way, but it's just more that that's how I view our role, which is to at times really spark those discussions and to try and make it really clear to other parts of the UN system that we can't be complacent when we see these human rights abuses and violations occur. Again, I would say that it's not all parts of the UN system that are like that, but when you're, I think, working with a lot of structure, with a lot of constraints, I know that as individuals, I have colleagues in the UN system who really want to say more, but they can't. And that's where I think we are able to help complement their work.
Yeah, and look, on my side, I mean, concretely, I'd say as a special rapporteur, and most special rapporteurs are in this position, we have three main functions. So one is annual thematic reports on contemporary human rights issues to the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and then the Third Committee of the General Assembly in New York. Those reports can be hopefully are kind of catalysts for change or reform, or to highlight or spotlight issues or problems which we think deserve more attention by other actors. It's often a useful platform for further advocacy and work by NGOs and friendly states on those kinds of issues. And as Pichamon mentioned, we can push further and harder than certain other actors or states may wish to on certain issues. So there's absolutely an element of progressive development in those reports, as well as sometimes just documentation of abuses as well. Secondly, we undertake what we call official country visits, where we go to a country for a couple of weeks, do a deep dive into all of their human rights laws and practices in the area relevant to our mandate. And then thirdly, communications, which are official diplomatic letters to governments through their foreign ministries, which raise allegations of either individual human rights violations, in particular cases, or reviews of legislation for its consistency with human rights law. And we make recommendations about how those can be improved. The state gets an opportunity to respond, and then after a while, our letters and their responses become public on a global database of communications. Again, the idea is that it's an opportunity to constructively work with governments to rectify problems. And if they don't, then it can go public. We can then issue press releases, do advocacy work, NGOs, etc. can pick it up and run with it. On top of all of that, I'd say, I mean, for my mandate specifically, counterterrorism and human rights, I'm also mandated to be a member of what we call the Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact, which is a group of 46 mainly UN bodies engaged in counterterrorism. So that's everybody from the United Nations Development Program through to UN Women, because counterterrorism is seen as a whole of UN and whole of society phenomenon, for rightly or wrongly, for better, for worse. And so that means that actually my mandate is more heavily based in New York than Geneva, I'd say. I mean, that's where the Security Council is, the General Assembly is, who are the big standard setters on counterterrorism. It's where the UN Office of Counterterrorism is, the Security Council sanctions committees, the Counterterrorism Executive Directorate of the Security Council. So there's a lot of activity in New York, and again, as Pichamon mentioned, that can create tensions because my mandate, it's been in existence for 20 years. And in that time, we've often been heavily critical of the Security Council and particular UN bodies in their counterterrorism practices for not sufficiently respecting or promoting human rights in counterterrorism, which, as you may appreciate, is a super securitized area. Lots of actors who aren't historically amenable to human rights. Funding has come from often countries like Russia, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, the United States, countries which don't have an amazing track record on human rights and counterterrorism, I'd say. And so all of that is a big part of the job as well. Finally, I'd just say, on top, in between all of those things, we do lots of other things which take up actually huge amounts of time. I mean, we do informal visits to other countries to meet with NGOs to investigate situations. We do a lot of consultations on different issues with a whole range of stakeholders. We do lots of bilateral diplomacy. We do lots of media. So look, the job in some ways is as big as you want it to be, and you've got a great platform to do that as an independent expert, mandated by the Human Rights Council. You've got a direct line to governments at a high level, and all of that helps you do the work. I know your second question was about how did you get appointed. Super quickly on that one, I'd say we're appointed supposedly on merit as independent experts. So it's not a political election like, for example, membership of UN human rights treaty bodies, where generally a government nominates you and then campaigns for you and horse trades votes so that you can get elected. There's a committee of 5 ambassadors representing the 5 geographic regions in the UN system. They look at all the applications, they shortlist, they interview the shortlisted candidates, they rank the top 3, they send that list to the president of the Human Rights Council, who conducts a round of consultation with member states, who can at that point object or support you. And then the president puts forward a nomination to the whole Human Rights Council, and then the appointment is made by consensus. So in theory, a single state could veto you, but normally the president's list is endorsed. Occasionally there are some switcheroos. So sometimes the second or even third or ranked candidate might be switched to number 1 somewhere along that process. Sometimes that's for gender reasons, sometimes for geography reasons, sometimes it's just political fighting by states where people get bumped because of their nationality, and absolutely that is hyper politicized at that point. On gender, I'd say we're doing actually pretty well. A majority of independent experts are women. On geography, not terrible, although I would say something like 30% of experts are from WEOG countries. That means Western Europe and other, which of course by world population is utterly disproportionate. It does reflect, of course, the production of knowledge in Western countries. And so, to acquire the expertise to get to this job, absolutely, you've got a head start if you're, a professor at Harvard as opposed to some unknown university or NGO in the global south, right? Having said that, I'd mentioned that different kinds of expertise get recognized and appointed. So it's not just professors, lots of colleagues have, activist NGO backgrounds precisely from global South countries. So it is in some ways, a relatively diverse mix, but could do a lot better.
I will say that I'm grateful to Ben for making that point on diversity and how important it is to not just special procedures, but equally to the UN system. And we know that there is a lot more that can be done in relation to that. I will just add also that in relation to those switcheroos that Ben mentioned, in terms of the ranking that gets sent over to the Human Rights Council president, I've also seen where the switcheroo happens because of the kind of the experience and the expertise of the expert that ultimately got chosen because they have a very specific experience that is relevant to that mandate. So it can also be because of that as well. I'll add in addition to kind of the various functions that Ben already listed, country visits, annual thematic reports to the Human Rights Council and the UN General Assembly, as well as our communications or submission of information procedure. For the working group specifically, our mandate also is tasked with organizing the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights. So this takes place every year in Geneva. It's the largest gathering in the world of business and human rights scholars and practitioners. The last one that we had was November last year, and we had more than 4,500, I believe, attendees in person and online, which was really impressive from 161 countries, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And it was, I shared that forum, so it was a real privilege. But every year we've seen growing attendance at these forums, which I think really helps to cement the message that rights holders and businesses alongside states actually want to see more human rights protection, not less. And this is one of the unique aspects, I would say, of the working group's mandate, which as a working group means that we have 5 members. So unlike a special rapporteur where it's only Ben doing so much of this work, working groups, we have 5 members who will represent each region of the world. So in my case, I represent Asia and the Pacific. And we basically divvy up the functions, and we are responsible alternating arrangements for instance, delivering the Human Rights Council report or the General Assembly. So last year, in addition to sharing the Business and Human Rights Forum in Geneva, I was also responsible for leading the thematic report to the General Assembly, which was on labor, migration, business, and human rights. So it's to say that we have slightly different compositions across special procedures as well. And for working groups, I would say that because there are 5 of us, sometimes it means that reaching a consensus can be that much harder. But at the same time, it also means that we can kind of share the load a little bit in that regard and work together to really ensure that what we are doing resonates with different regions. I'll quickly add to that for the working group's mandate, we are explicitly mandated with engaging with businesses as well, which is an aspect that I would say is very useful for special procedures. We often collaborate with other mandate holders because the human rights abuse case that they're looking at may well have a business dimension to it. And so we can come in and help provide kind of guidance and language around the business responsibility to respect human rights. And as a result, I think that's one of the reasons why the working group has been able to, I get told that it's a consensus mandate in the sense that a lot of states support it because they actually want to see businesses more engaged in the UN system addressing, these human rights problems.
Thank you for that kind of great overview of what it is that you guys do with this. So for the last kind of substantive set of questions we have for the episode, what's the most rewarding part of your role and what's the most difficult part of it? And do either of you have a story about the work you've done in the role that will help, that you can share, that will to help listeners understand the role more?
Look, for me, I'd say most rewarding is being able to amplify the voices of victims and bring those stories to the attention of the responsible governments at a very high level and hope to persuade or cajole or shame them to change course. There are lots of good people working even in bad governments to try to change things from within, and you do have sometimes success stories, and you are able to move the dial a little bit. On what's most difficult, I'd say foremost, the very practical, acute lack of resources to do this work. I don't expect to be paid, but the problem is I'm meant to monitor human rights violations in 193 countries, cover 46 UN entities, with virtually no staff, resources, budget to do it, right? So it is, I mean, it is absolutely a kind of exploitative model that states have established. On the one hand, they say they take human rights seriously. They, want these monitoring functions to work and to be effective, but then they starve them of anything like the level of resources needed to make them as effective as possible. I mean, to give you an illustration, the Australian Counter-Terrorism Monitor, a statutory position here in Australia, covers one country and has a budget of a few $1 million, a staff of 10 people. I have almost no budget and two staff to cover 193 countries. I mean, that shows you just how cosmetic a lot of states really see these human rights mechanisms as. Now, we do our best to make sure it's not cosmetic, but of course, it does mean we're absolutely ourselves being forced to use volunteers and law clinics and interns and rely on a whole system of unpaid labor, which itself, of course, is deeply inequitable because what intern can afford to live in Geneva for 6 months, helping us out, unless you've got a rich US law school backing you, or a rich family, or in some cases you've worked very, very hard and scrabbled the resources together to support yourself. But it's super inequitable. The other difficulty I'd say at the moment in particular is just the political climate, right? I mean, the rise of populism and authoritarianism, a massive decline in political and financial support for human rights and multilateralism, this kind of more transactional power politics, everyone afraid to criticize the United States for fear of retaliation. And meanwhile, the global legal order is kind of burning down around everybody. Now, that's not good for anybody's prosperity or security or human rights in the longer term. And the less countries speak up, the more it emboldens autocrats to do worse. Former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull was dead right that Trump respects strength. You have to stand up to him. You can't just keep appeasing him every time he, murders alleged narco-terrorists in the Caribbean or threatens to invade Greenland or somewhere else. In terms of a story, look, I'd say. Yeah, there is absolutely good news in dark times every now and again. I mean, I remember, just to give one example, we did a prison visit in West Africa in a setting which is utterly squalid, prisons not fit for human habitation, 170 prisoners in a room 11 meters by 6 or 7 meters. I mean, utterly subhuman. And of course, the government said, there are no children detained amongst adults. We follow a strict segregation policy in accordance with international law and the Mandela rules on detention conditions. But sure enough, there's a 14-year-old kid detained amongst hundreds of alleged jihadi terrorists, worst of the worst, according to the government. We reported that to the Minister for Justice. To his credit, he got onto it. He got the kid out of detention pretty quickly. So you can make small changes every now and again. Am I going to stop Trump exploiting Gaza and giving political and military and all kinds of cover to Israeli atrocities in Palestine? Of course not. But we do what we can. And I remember last year I visited my last official country visit was to Somalia, which is actually in some ways terrible news, but also great news. Terrible because, poorest country on earth pretty much, really difficult governance challenges, hammered by climate change. It's getting smashed by, Al-Shabaab terrorists controlling half the country, ISIS in the north. And yet, this is a country which is genuinely, so far as I could tell, committed to reform, building rule of law structures, strengthening human rights at a time when, the international community is deserting it by slashing humanitarian funding, leading, for example, to the closure of every single rape crisis center in the country. And a tiny amounts of money could keep them going. But of course, in this climate, no one's paying for those kinds of basic needs. And at the same time, the US slashing the UN peacekeeping budget, which makes it more likely that terrorists will prevail in a place like Somalia. So utterly counterproductive, not just on the human rights front, but for African and global security reasons as well. But it is a good news story because even under the hardest conditions, some countries try to do the right thing when, some rich Western democracies at the slightest sniff of terrorism take the gloves off, show no restraint, start torturing, rendering, illegally killing. So, it's not all grim news.
I'll add to that and say that I agree with Ben that one of the most challenging aspects of doing this job right now is the liquidity crisis and the fact that special procedures is heavily impacted with all of the budget cuts, with the US and other states, in fact, not paying their dues. We've had to cut our country visits down from two to just one. And there are a range of other cost cutting measures that have been implemented too that do have an impact on our ability to carry out our functions as independent mandate holders. At the same time, I would say that the most rewarding part of this role is in a way connected with the most challenging aspects of this role, because all along the way, in experiencing and hearing the really horrific abuses and violations that people have to endure in many parts of the world, you also see the best that humanity has to offer in terms of the fearless human rights defenders on the ground who are working to protect the rights of those who are constantly marginalized and put at risk. You meet, as Ben was saying, people in governments, even in governments where they don't really work, but there are people within government who can be extremely dedicated in wanting to do the right thing and affect change. And add to that the people that you come across in the UN system as well, whether it be in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, UNHCR, IOM, ILO, or elsewhere, you see some very, very passionate individuals who, despite the current situation, despite all the pressures that they face, they are still wanting to try and affect positive change for rights holders. I can't tell you how many times I hear from colleagues working within the UN system that the reason why they're doing this work is because they want to ensure that rights holders are put first and foremost at the front of minds of states, of businesses, and that to me is something that we need to be celebrating and we need to acknowledge alongside all of the bad news stories that we hear right now. And I mean, the situation in the US, what Trump has been doing, the assault on human rights is really, it's really abhorrent. There's just no other way to describe it. For the working group, we've seen how this has impacted, the business commitment to things that we thought weren't ever going to be questioned again, to things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. Right. And so that backrolling in commitments and in practice is concerning on so many levels, because it means, again, that we are seeing the international legal order. We're seeing human rights being undermined on a daily basis as a result. But look, in terms of the story that I would like to share in all of this is that it is one that I feel really epitomizes both the challenges and the most rewarding aspects of this role. And it comes from my experience in conducting country visits. I've been on country visits to Argentina, to Colombia, and to Japan. And this one in particular took place in Japan, which obviously is a very different context from where Ben has been to, like Somalia and elsewhere. But for me, Japan was an intriguing case from a business and human rights perspective because the country is advanced in so many different ways. And at the same time, we are also aware that Japanese society's awareness of human rights more generally is perhaps not quite widespread, right? And there are a lot of gaps in that regard. Japan does not have a national human rights institution, for instance. And so despite all of the government commitments, we see an unevenness in how the government actually implements its commitment to human rights and to upholding the UN guiding principles on business and human rights more specifically. But in any case, in going on this Japan country visit, I remember, kind of thinking things through with my colleagues, thinking about the cases that we would be looking into. And for that, we engaged in a lot of consultations with rights holders on the ground, with businesses, as well as with the state, i.e. Japan in this case. And so ultimately, like what you saw us, the issues that we covered in our country visit are very much informed by those consultations, as well as, by the information that we're able to gather whilst there. And it was interesting to me that, we covered issues ranging from migrant labor abuse through to the experiences of communities impacted by the Fukushima nuclear disaster. And I must say it's just really very, very sad what they had to experience as individuals, as a community, and what they continue to experience as well. And you can actually read more about this in our report on the country visit. But one of the cases that became very prominent over the course of our country visit was one involving the sexual assault and abuse of young boys as part of this idol training company and an idol management company in Japan, at the time known as Johnny and Associates. So it's an extremely well-known company. And the abuse was at the hands of the then founder and CEO of this company, who died several years back, I would say. But when we were there, we spoke directly with the victims. We heard about all of the terrible things that they had to go through as 10-year-olds, as 14-year-olds. And I still remember, like, as someone who has engaged these issues before and was rather well prepared for what I was about to hear, it was so shocking. And I recall going back to my hotel room that evening thinking, yeah, this is terrible. And unless we try to do something about this and to ensure that the victims' voices are heard, then it kind of feels, I question myself why I'm doing this, and whether I am actually contributing in the way that I wanted to contribute to this role. But all of that's to say that, the victims weren't being heard, in large part because there's still this perception in Japanese society that boys cannot be abused by men. And so there are some traditional gender norms there that were prohibiting these victims from being able to speak out about the atrocious things they had suffered at the hands of this individual. And by the time we announced the findings of our country visit, including our findings in relation to this case, where at the time my colleagues and we having spoken with victims, and we also engaged with the business, we believed that the number of victims would be in the hundreds. As it turns out, it was actually in the thousands. But I recall that at the time, people were, as in members of the public, were actively questioning, how we were able to arrive at that number, whether, this is something that's been fabricated by the victims. And I must say that harassment that the victims faced also, because they had gone to the media about this. And so some of them, their identities were known. It was, again, a very difficult moment, because whilst we felt we were making an impact of this country visit, we were also very concerned about the welfare of the victims who we'd spoken with. Ultimately, though, I'm happy to say that although the process is ongoing, the business involved in this particular case ultimately, because of a range of other factors as well, such as their own inquiry into the allegations of sexual abuse and exploitation, combined with the attention that our country visit had garnered, the business ultimately shut itself down. So the CEO then resigned, issued a public apology to the victims before doing so. A new company was set up in order to focus on providing compensation to the victims, with a commitment also provided to the victims that, you know, any future business by this company would see the establishment of an operational level grievance mechanism that would be accessible by victims, with also mental health assistance provided or mental health support provided to victims or anyone who should use those grievance mechanisms as well. We also saw or heard from the government that they were going to adopt a range of new safeguards, especially to assist children who are victims of exploitation, especially in the media and entertainment industry. We also had the government put in place new laws, for instance, around the rights of freelancers. And so there was a lot of change that we were able to generate, a lot of impact that we were able to generate from that country visit. But I will say that it was not at all easy, as to be expected. And it really had I would say, a very real impact on my own personal kind of state, in that it just really underscored the importance of the work that we're doing, but the very real lives that are impacted by human rights violations and abuses every day on a global scale. And to me, that's the gravity of the situation that I personally feel I have to confront and deal with in doing this work.
Thank you for both for like such compelling insights into the day-to-day of your work. We are going to move into the wrap-up question, which is a non-international law question, and it's a little bit lighter to try and kind of finish on a bit of a different note. And because no one in the Call to the Bar team has decided on a season 3 question still, I'm exercising my discretion as host to ask one that I want to know the answer to, which is, what is your ultimate comfort food? Where do you get the best version of it, and where can listeners find a good recipe for it?
Look, for me, I've got a primary school aged kid, so our culinary world is a pretty low bar at the moment. It's just burgers and chips, right? Anywhere with a deep fryer will do. Yeah, not high standards in our place.
I'd like to copy Ben's answer, but I did have a serious think about, you know, what kind of foods just now hearing your question, Tamsin, and I would say it's actually my mom's green chicken curry. And you can't really get that anywhere else, but that to me is my ultimate comfort food. I can eat it all day.
That does sound delicious, and when she's in Canberra next, you'll have to get her to make some for me as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you both so much for your time, and thank you, listeners, for tuning in. We'll catch you next time. Bye bye.
Thanks. Goodbye.